They ripped off all my clothes as punishment. Then Caveman showed my sacred mark. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the polished mahogany floors of the Thornton mansion as Elizabeth adjusted the pearl necklace at her throat. At 52, she remained a vision of refined elegance. Her auburn hair swept into a sophisticated chignon, her emerald silk gown hugging curves that spoke of a woman who had lived well, but not without purpose. The mirror reflected a face that had weathered 5 decades with grace, laugh lines around intelligent hazel eyes, skin that bore the subtle marks of time but remained luminous. The evening had been perfect, as most of her evenings were. Dinner with the Astors, conversation about the new opera season, plans for the upcoming charity ball to benefit the orphanage. Elizabeth's life moved in predictable, comfortable circles, the kind of existence that money and social position could provide. Yet tonight something felt different. An unease she couldn't quite name had been growing stronger with each passing hour. "Mrs. Thornton, will you be needing anything else this evening?" Martha, her longtime housekeeper, appeared in the doorway of the master bedroom. The elderly woman had been with the family since Elizabeth was a child, more companion than servant, witness to every triumph and sorrow of the past 30 years. "No, thank you, Martha. You may retire for the night." Elizabeth's voice carried the cultured tones of San Francisco high society, but there was warmth there, genuine care for those who served her household. It was one of the qualities that set her apart from many of her peers. She never forgot that others had feelings, dreams, and lives beyond their service to her comfort. Martha nodded and withdrew, but not before casting a concerned look at her mistress. The old woman had noticed Elizabeth's distraction, the way she'd been staring out windows, starting at unexpected sounds. Something was troubling Mrs. Thornton, and Martha's protective instincts were aroused. Left alone with her thoughts, Elizabeth moved to the tall windows that overlooked the gas-lit streets of Nob Hill. The city sprawled below her like a jeweled tapestry, prosperous and safe behind its walls of wealth and privilege. She'd lived here for 20 years, ever since her marriage to Charles Thornton, and before that as the adopted daughter of the missionary couple who'd saved her from… what? Her earliest memories were fragments, pieces of a puzzle that never quite fit together. The Reverend and Mrs. Patterson had found her at a mission in California when she was 5 years old, a traumatized child with no memory of her origins save for nightmares that made her wake screaming. They'd been kind, gentle people who'd given her every advantage, then arranged her adoption by the wealthy Thorntons when their advancing age made it clear they couldn't provide for a growing girl's needs. Elizabeth had been grateful, had embraced her new life with the determination of someone who understood how precious security could be. She'd married well, been widowed young, and spent the decades since managing her inheritance and social obligations with skill and grace. But the questions about her past had never quite disappeared, lingering like shadows at the edge of her consciousness. Perhaps it was the letter that had arrived that morning, unsigned, containing only a crude drawing of a crescent moon and the words, "We know who you are." She'd shown it to no one, told herself it was probably some sort of prank or mistake. But the unease had been growing ever since, a feeling that her carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down. The crash of splintering wood downstairs shattered the evening's tranquility like a gunshot. Elizabeth's heart lurched as heavy boots thundered up the marble staircase, accompanied by rough voices and the sound of furniture being overturned. Her servants were screaming somewhere below, their cries cut short by harsh commands to stay quiet. Elizabeth rushed toward her bedroom door, but it burst open before she could reach it, the heavy oak panels slamming against the wall with enough force to crack the plaster. 3 men in black masks filled the doorway, their eyes glittering with malevolent purpose through the crude eye-holes. They were dressed like working men, rough clothes, heavy boots, gun belts that spoke of violence as a profession. The largest stepped forward, and Elizabeth could see he was built like a prize fighter, with massive shoulders and hands that looked capable of crushing bone. When he spoke, his voice was rough as sandpaper, carrying the accent of the frontier. Elizabeth Thornton, or should we say, daughter of Aguila Dorada. Elizabeth's blood ran cold. She'd heard that name before, in the nightmares that still sometimes visited her sleep, a tall figure on horseback, calling to her in a language she didn't understand. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, backing against the window, her voice trembling but defiant. "How dare you break into my home? Cut the act, lady." The second man was thin as a whip with cold blue eyes visible through his mask, his movements quick and precise like a striking snake. He pulled out a knife that gleamed wickedly in the lamplight, its blade long enough to gut a man with a single stroke. "We know what you're hiding under those fancy clothes." Before Elizabeth could scream, before she could even fully process what was happening, the third man, silent but swift as his companions, grabbed her arms with a grip like iron bands. She struggled desperately, her silk slippers sliding on the polished floor, but he was far stronger than she was. "Strip her," the large man commanded, his voice casual as if he were ordering dinner. "Find the mark." "No." Elizabeth fought with desperate strength as rough hands grabbed at her dress, her carefully styled hair coming loose as she thrashed her head back and forth. "Stop! Please! I'll give you money, jewelry, whatever you want." But they weren't interested in her wealth. The emerald silk gown that had cost more than most men earned in a year tore like paper as they ripped it away. Then her corset, then her delicate chemise. Elizabeth's face burned with humiliation and terror as they examined every inch of exposed skin with the methodical thoroughness of men accustomed to such violations. "Please," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm a respectable woman. Whatever you think I've done." Her words died as the large man's fingers found her right shoulder blade, pressing against what he'd discovered there. The room went utterly silent, except for Elizabeth's ragged breathing and the distant sound of her servants weeping downstairs. "Jesus Christ," the big man whispered, staring at what they'd uncovered. "It's really her." There, on Elizabeth's pale shoulder, was a birthmark in the perfect shape of a crescent moon, no larger than a silver dollar but distinct as if branded by the gods themselves. The skin was slightly darker there, creating a perfect lunar arc that seemed to glow in the lamplight. "The sacred mark of the moon daughter," the thin man breathed, his voice filled with something approaching reverence. 20 years we've been searching, following false leads and dead ends, and she's been living in luxury while her people rotted on reservations." Elizabeth's mind reeled, fragments of memory stirring like sediment in a disturbed pool. A woman's voice, singing in a language that wasn't English, Spanish, or any other tongue she'd learned. Strong hands lifting her onto a horse. The sound of gunfire in the distance, and smoke that blotted out the stars. "What are you talking about?" she managed to say, though her voice came out as barely a whisper. "I don't understand." "You will." The large man's grin was predatory as he nodded to his companions. "Get her dressed and ready to travel. Something plain that won't attract attention. The colonel's been waiting a long time for this reunion." They threw her a rough cotton dress and worn boots, clearly brought for this purpose, standing guard while she dressed with shaking hands. The coarse fabric felt alien against skin accustomed to silk and satin, but it was better than the alternative of traveling naked. As they bound her wrists with hemp rope that bit into her skin, Elizabeth found her voice. "Who are you? What do you want with me? I have money, connections. My disappearance will be noticed." "Name's Jake Morrison," the large man said, carefully pocketing a photograph one of his companions had taken of the crescent mark. "This here's Snake Williams and Tommy Garrett. And you, sweetheart, are going to make us very rich men. That little moon on your back is worth more than all the gold in California." "You're insane. It's just a birthmark." Morrison's laughter was harsh and ugly. "Lady, that birthmark is your ticket to a fortune. And ours too if we play our cards right." They hauled her downstairs, past furniture that had been overturned in their search, past servants who cowered in corners with eyes full of terror and sympathy. Elizabeth wanted to reassure them, to tell them she'd be all right. But the gag they'd forced between her teeth made speech impossible. The carriage waiting outside was plain and unmarked, designed to blend in with the dozens of similar vehicles that traveled California's roads every day. As they shoved her inside, Elizabeth caught a glimpse of Martha watching from an upstairs window, her wrinkled face wet with tears. The carriage ride through the night was a nightmare of jolting roads, and Morrison's companions taking turns describing what would happen if she tried to escape. But it was Morrison's story, told in low, gloating tones as they left San Francisco's lights behind, that truly terrified her. 20 years ago, he began, lighting a cigarette that filled the small space with acrid smoke. There was an Apache chief named Aguila Dorada, Golden Eagle, smart bastard, maybe the smartest Indian the army ever faced. While other tribes were getting themselves slaughtered or driven onto reservations, Golden Eagle kept his people hidden in the mountains, fighting a guerrilla war that made the brass in Washington plenty mad. Elizabeth pressed herself against the carriage wall, trying to make sense of what she was hearing. Apache. She'd been raised to believe she was the orphaned daughter of missionaries, killed in some frontier accident. But the colonel, he was smarter than the other army boys, spent years studying the Apache, learning their ways, their beliefs, and he found out something real interesting about old Golden Eagle. Morrison's eyes glittered in the darkness. The chief had a little girl, born with that moon mark you're carrying. Sacred to the Apache, that mark meant she was chosen by their moon goddess, destined to be the keeper of their most precious secrets. That's impossible, Elizabeth said when they briefly removed her gag to give her water. I was raised by the Thorntons since I was 5. They found me at a mission. Mission my ass. Snake's laughter was like breaking glass. You were found after we burned out Golden Eagle's camp. Most of them died fighting like Indians do, but you got away somehow. Couple of bleeding heart missionaries found you wandering half dead in the desert, cleaned you up, and shipped you off to San Francisco to play white lady. The world tilted around Elizabeth as suppressed memories began to surface. Images flashed through her mind. A village of skin lodges nestled in a hidden canyon, women grinding corn while children played nearby. A tall man with kind eyes and strong hands teaching her to ride a spotted pony. A woman with long black hair singing lullabies in words that felt like home. No, she whispered, but even as she said it, she knew they were telling the truth. The nightmares weren't random terrors. They were memories her mind had buried to protect her from unbearable pain. Check this out, Tommy said, pulling out a yellowed document. Even in the dim carriage light, Elizabeth could see it was written in Spanish and English, with official seals and signatures. An adoption record from the San Gabriel mission, dated October 1867. Name of child, unknown female, approximately age 5, found after Apache raid. Distinguishing marks, crescent-shaped birthmark on right shoulder. Elizabeth's hands shook as she read the damning evidence. Everything she'd believed about herself, about her life, about her very identity, crumbled like sand. She wasn't Elizabeth Thornton, refined lady of San Francisco society. She was someone else entirely, someone whose people had been murdered while she lived in luxury, ignorant of her origins. But why now? She asked, her voice hollow with shock. Why after all these years? Morrison's grin was predatory as he leaned forward, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the gold tooth that glinted when he smiled. Because, darling, that mark of yours is the key to something the colonels wanted for 20 years. Your daddy Golden Eagle? He was a clever bastard. When he saw the writing on the wall, when he knew the army was closing in, he hid something. Something worth more than all the silver in Nevada. I don't know anything about any treasure. Maybe not yet, Morrison said, settling back in his seat with obvious satisfaction. But you will. The Apache, they got ways of awakening blood memory. Old ceremonies, old magic that goes back to the beginning of time. By the time we're done with you, you'll remember things you never knew you forgot. The carriage continued its relentless journey south and east, toward the Arizona territory. Elizabeth closed her eyes and tried to pray, but the words seemed hollow in her mouth. How could she pray to a God who had allowed her people to be slaughtered, who had let her live in ignorance while others suffered? Instead, she found herself humming a melody that rose from some deep place in her memory, a lullaby in a language she was beginning to remember. Apache words that spoke of love and protection, of a mother's promise that her daughter would never be forgotten. As dawn broke over the increasingly desolate landscape, Morrison pointed to a cloud of dust on the horizon. Should be smooth sailing from here. This country ain't got nothing but rocks and rattlesnakes and bones. But even as he spoke, the sound of gunfire erupted around them like thunder. The carriage driver screamed and toppled from his perch, blood spreading across his chest as masked riders closed in from both sides, their horses kicking up clouds of dust that made it hard to see. "Bandits!" Tommy shouted, drawing his gun and immediately beginning to return fire through the carriage window. No, Morrison snarled, recognizing the attackers' tactics and equipment. These are Comancheros, Mexican bandits who trade with hostile Indians. They must have been tracking us since we left the city. The carriage lurched violently as bullets shattered the windows, showering Elizabeth with glass. She was thrown against the side as the horses, maddened by gunfire and the smell of blood, bolted toward a rocky canyon that yawned ahead like an open mouth. Morrison and his men were too busy shooting to notice as Elizabeth worked frantically at her bonds, using a sharp piece of broken glass to saw at the rope around her wrists. The hemp fibers parted slowly, painfully, cutting her skin as she worked. The battle raged around them as the runaway carriage careened across the desert floor. Elizabeth could hear the Comancheros shouting to each other in rapid Spanish, their guns barking as they tried to bring down Morrison's men without destroying their valuable cargo. A particularly violent jolt as the carriage wheel hit a boulder snapped the rope around Elizabeth's wrists just as the entire vehicle flipped, throwing all 4 passengers into the rocky desert sand. Elizabeth hit the ground hard, pain shooting through her ribs and left shoulder, but adrenaline drove her to her feet. Morrison lay stunned nearby, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead where he'd struck a rock. Snake and Tommy were tangled in the wreckage, groaning and cursing as they tried to extract themselves. The bandits were still exchanging fire with someone, probably other travelers who'd gotten caught in the crossfire. This was her chance. Elizabeth ran. Her worn boots weren't made for desert terrain, but terror gave her speed and endurance she didn't know she possessed. She scrambled up the rocky slope, ignoring the thorns that tore at her cotton dress and the stones that cut her hands. Behind her, she could hear Morrison shouting as he regained consciousness. "Find her! She can't have gone far. $500 to the man who brings her back alive." But the desert was vast and unforgiving, a maze of canyons and mesas that stretched to every horizon. Elizabeth stumbled through arroyos and over rocky ridges, the sun climbing higher and turning the air into a furnace that sucked the moisture from her body with each labored breath. By midday, she was lost. The mountains seemed to shift and dance in the heat, landmarks dissolving into mirages that beckoned and disappeared. Every shadow looked like a pursuer, every rock formation like a hiding place that might conceal enemies. She tried to retrace her steps, but everything looked the same. Endless red stone and scrub brush under a merciless blue sky. Her tongue felt thick with thirst, her vision began to blur, and the cotton dress that had seemed so coarse now felt like sandpaper against her sunburned skin. The boots rubbed her feet raw, but she didn't dare stop, driven by the fear that Morrison was somewhere behind her, following her trail like a bloodhound. "Please," she whispered to whatever gods might be listening, her voice a dry croak in the empty air. "I don't want to die out here. Not like this. Not when I'm just beginning to remember who I am." But the desert had no mercy for the unprepared. Elizabeth's legs gave out as she crested another hill, and she tumbled down the far side, coming to rest against a large boulder that radiated heat like a blacksmith's forge. Everything hurt. Her ribs from the carriage crash, her feet from the terrible boots, her skin from the sun's relentless assault. As consciousness faded, she thought she saw a figure moving among the rocks above her, tall, powerful, watching with eyes that seemed familiar. But it might have been just another desert mirage, another trick of her dying mind. The last thing Elizabeth remembered was the sound of boots on stone, careful and deliberate, and a voice, deep and rough as whiskey, saying, "Well, I'll be damned. The moon daughter herself come home at last." Elizabeth woke to the sound of water dripping, and the scent of wood smoke mingled with something else, herbs and sage, smells that stirred memories she couldn't quite grasp. Her body ached in places she hadn't known existed, but she was alive, and more importantly, she was cool and sheltered. Opening her eyes slowly, she found herself lying on a bed of soft animal furs in what appeared to be a natural cave. But this wasn't just a hole in the rock. Someone had made this place into a home. Firelight danced on stone walls covered with Native American symbols painted in red and black, military maps marked with notations in careful handwriting, and what looked like botanical drawings of desert plants. Weapons hung from natural ledges, rifles and pistols kept in perfect condition, knives with bone handles, a bow and quiver of arrows fletched with hawk feathers. Books were stacked in alcoves carved into the rock. their leather bindings worn from repeated reading. The cave was clearly someone's permanent residence, but whose? "About time you woke up," Elizabeth startled, sitting up too quickly and immediately regretting it as her head spun and her bruised ribs protested. A man emerged from the shadows near the cave mouth, and her breath caught in her throat. He was perhaps 45 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with long dark hair streaked with silver that he wore tied back with a leather cord. His beard hadn't seen a razor in months, but it was clean and well-kept, framing a face that was lean and weathered by years of outdoor living. Scars marked his visible skin, a puckered bullet wound on his left shoulder, knife cuts on his hands and forearms, all telling the story of a hard and dangerous life. But it was his eyes that held her, pale blue, intelligent, but haunted by something deep and painful. They were the eyes of a man who'd seen too much, done things he regretted, and found little peace in his solitude. He wore buckskin pants and a cotton shirt that had once been white but was now the color of desert sand. A gun belt hung low on his hips, the revolver well-maintained and positioned for a quick draw. Everything about him spoke of competence and danger, but there was something else, a gentleness in the way he moved, a carefulness that suggested he was more than the wild man his appearance suggested. "Who are you?" Elizabeth pulled the fur blanket closer around herself, realizing someone had changed her torn dress for a soft leather shirt and pants that were clearly too large for her. The leather was supple and well-worked, decorated with beadwork in patterns that seemed familiar. "Marcus Stone." His voice carried the educated accent of the East, incongruous with his wild appearance. "Though most folks around here call me Caveman on account of where I live." He gestured to the cave walls with a slight smile that transformed his stern features. "And you are?" "Elizabeth Thornton." She studied his face, looking for any sign of threat, but found only wariness and curiosity. There was something about him that made her feel safe despite his intimidating appearance. "How long have I been here?" 3 days. You were near dead when I found you. Dehydration, exposure, exhaustion. Your feet were cut to ribbons and you had the beginning of heat stroke." Marcus moved to a natural shelf carved into the rock and retrieved a clay cup. "Drink this, it's just water, but I added some herbs to help with the healing." Elizabeth accepted the cup gratefully, the cool liquid like heaven on her parched throat. The herbs gave it a slightly bitter taste, but she could feel strength flowing back into her body with each swallow. "Thank you," she said simply. "You saved my life." "Maybe. You're tougher than you look, city lady." Marcus sat down on a rock ledge across from her, maintaining a respectful distance. "What were you doing wandering the desert alone? This isn't exactly a place for afternoon strolls." Elizabeth hesitated, unsure how much to reveal to this stranger. But something in his manner, the way he'd cared for her without taking advantage, made her trust him. 3 men kidnapped me from San Francisco. They said—" She paused, the words still sounding impossible even to her own ears. "They said I was someone I'm not." Marcus's expression shifted slightly, becoming more alert. "What kind of someone?" "They claimed I was Apache, that I have some kind of sacred mark that makes me valuable." Elizabeth set down the empty cup, watching his reaction carefully. "It sounds insane, I know." To her surprise, Marcus went very still, his pale eyes fixed on her face with sudden intensity. "Show me." "I beg your pardon?" "The mark. Show me." His voice was gentle but insistent, and Elizabeth caught something in his tone. Not the crude demand of her captors, but the request of someone who understood the significance of what he was asking. "Please, I need to see it." Something in his eyes made Elizabeth trust him, though she couldn't say why. Slowly, she turned her back to him and lowered the leather shirt from her right shoulder, exposing the crescent moon birthmark that had changed her life. She heard Marcus draw in a sharp breath, followed by a long moment of silence. When she turned back around, his face had gone pale beneath his tan, and his hands were clenched into fists. "Jesus," he whispered, running one hand through his hair. "You really are her. After all these years, you're really alive. You know about the mark?" Elizabeth pulled the shirt back up, her heart racing. "You know what it means?" Marcus stood and began pacing the small cave, his movements restless as a caged wolf. 20 years ago, I was a cavalry lieutenant, 2nd Battalion, Arizona Territory. My commanding officer was Colonel Samuel Bradley, ambitious, cruel, and convinced that every Apache in the territory was sitting on a fortune in hidden gold. He stopped pacing long enough to pour himself a cup of water from a large clay jar, his hands trembling slightly. Bradley became obsessed with a chief named Golden Eagle, Águila Dorada. The man was a tactical genius, kept his people safe while every other tribe was being slaughtered or driven onto reservations. Bradley couldn't stand it. He took it as a personal insult that one Indian was outsmarting the entire United States Army. Elizabeth felt a chill despite the warmth of the cave. What happened? Bradley spent months gathering intelligence, bribing traders, and captured warriors for information about Golden Eagle's stronghold. And eventually, he found out about Golden Eagle's daughter, a little girl born with that mark you're carrying. Marcus's voice turned bitter, filled with self-loathing. According to Apache legend, the Moon Daughter would be the key to her people's greatest treasure. Bradley became convinced it was literal gold, maybe a mine or a cache hidden somewhere in the mountains. But you didn't believe that? I didn't know what to believe. I was 25 years old, fresh out of West Point, full of ideas about honor and duty and protecting civilization from savage Indians. Marcus laughed harshly. Bradley convinced me and the rest of the battalion that we were going to prevent a massive Apache uprising, that Golden Eagle was planning to unite all the tribes and drive the white man out of Arizona. Elizabeth watched his face, seeing the pain there, the guilt that had been eating at him for 2 decades. You participated in the attack on my father's village. I led the attack. The words came out flat and emotionless, but Elizabeth could see the agony behind them. Bradley planned a night raid on the village. God help me, I tried to tell myself we were soldiers following orders, that it was necessary for the greater good. But you knew it was wrong. Deep down, yes. But I was a coward. I was more afraid of being court-martialed for disobedience than I was of murdering innocent people. Marcus stopped pacing and looked directly at her, his eyes filled with shame. The raid was a massacre, Elizabeth. We killed everyone we could find. Warriors, women, children, elders. Bradley's men went mad with bloodlust, convinced they were about to get rich. Elizabeth felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but she wasn't sure if they were for the family she'd lost or for the young man Marcus had been, forced to live with such terrible knowledge. What happened to my parents? Your father died fighting to protect his people, trying to buy time for some of them to escape into the mountains. He was magnificent, fearless, defiant to the end. Your mother, Marcus's voice broke slightly. She died shielding you with her body. By the time we found you, you were unconscious, covered in her blood but miraculously unharmed. The pain in Elizabeth's chest was sharp and immediate, a grief that felt fresh despite the 20 years that had passed. She saved me. They all did. The entire village died to protect you and the few others who managed to escape. Marcus sat down heavily, his shoulders bowed with the weight of memory. Bradley went insane when he realized you'd disappeared. He ordered us to search every canyon, every cave, every possible hiding place. But you'd vanished like smoke. The missionaries found me. Must have. A couple of the men in my unit had consciences left. Sergeant Murphy and Private Collins. They probably got you out during the confusion, left you where they knew you'd be found by people who'd care for you properly. Marcus studied her face intently. You don't remember any of it? Nightmares, Elizabeth admitted, the memories becoming clearer with each word he spoke. Always the same. Smoke and fire, people screaming, a woman singing in a language I didn't understand. I thought they were just dreams, fears my mind had created. Your mother, probably. Apache women sing to their children during times of danger, believing the songs will protect them and guide their spirits safely to the next world. Marcus's voice was gentle now, full of compassion for the small girl she'd been. She was trying to comfort you while the village burned around you. Elizabeth closed her eyes, and suddenly she could hear it clearly. Her mother's voice, strong and beautiful even in the face of death, singing words of love and protection in the Apache tongue. Sleep, little moon daughter. The spirits watch over you. Your path leads to safety, and you will live to honor our people. What happened to you after the raid? She asked, needing to focus on something other than her overwhelming grief. Marcus's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. I couldn't live with what we'd done. The official report called it a glorious victory against hostile savages, but I knew the truth. We'd murdered an entire village of people whose only crime was wanting to live free. He stood and walked to the cave entrance, staring out at the desert beyond. That night I took my horse and whatever supplies I could carry, and I deserted. Been hiding in these mountains ever since, trying to find some way to make amends for what I helped destroy. 15 years is a long time to live alone. It's the life I chose, the life I deserved. Marcus's tone suggested the subject was closed, but Elizabeth caught something in his eyes. Loneliness as vast as the desert outside, a hunger for human connection that he'd been denying himself for decades. What have you been doing all this time? Just surviving? Marcus was quiet for a moment, then gestured to the maps on the walls. Protecting what's left. There are survivors out there, small bands of Apache and other tribes who escaped the reservations, families who've been hiding in places the army considers too remote or worthless to bother with. Elizabeth looked more closely at the maps and realized they were marked with symbols and notations in multiple hands. This wasn't just Marcus's hideout. It was a center of communication for scattered groups of people trying to stay alive and free. You've been helping them, when I can, warning them when patrols are coming, providing supplies, medical aid. It's not much, but it's something. Marcus turned back to her, his expression serious. Which brings us to why those men took you now, after all these years. Elizabeth explained about Morrison and his companions, about their claims regarding Colonel Bradley's continued obsession with Apache treasure. Marcus listened with growing anger, his hands clenching into fists as she described her kidnapping and the long journey into the desert. Bradley never gave up, he said finally, his voice tight with rage. That bastard's been searching for you all this time, probably following every lead, bribing officials to search through adoption records and mission files. But what treasure could be worth 20 years of hunting? If it was gold, surely someone would have found it by now. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring into the small fire that provided light and warmth to the cave. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. What if it wasn't gold? What if Bradley misunderstood what the treasure really was? What do you mean? The Apache are a desert people, Elizabeth. To them, the most precious thing in this country isn't metal that you can dig out of the ground. It's water. Fresh water, reliable water. Enough to support a large population in a land where most places are lucky to get 10 inches of rain a year. Elizabeth felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in her mind. And my father knew where to find water? Think about it. Golden Eagle kept his people hidden for years while the army hunted them. That takes more than just clever tactics. It takes reliable sources of water, game, shelter. Places that could support a community indefinitely without being detected. Marcus met her eyes. What if Golden Eagle's treasure was a map to hidden springs and underground rivers? Water sources that could turn worthless desert into productive farmland? And Bradley wants to control those water sources. A man who controlled the water in Arizona territory would be richer and more powerful than any gold baron. He could decide which towns prospered and which dried up and blew away. He could sell water rights to the railroad companies, to cattle ranchers, to anyone who wanted to develop this country. Marcus's expression was grim and more dangerous than any mere treasure hunter. Before Elizabeth could respond, the sound of horses outside the cave froze them both. Marcus instantly moved to the fire and kicked sand over it, plunging the cave into darkness. He grabbed his rifle and motioned for Elizabeth to move deeper into the cave, where the shadows would hide her completely. "Morrison?" she whispered. "Maybe. Stay quiet and stay hidden no matter what happens." Marcus crept to the cave entrance, using the natural rock formations to observe the riders below without exposing himself. Elizabeth's heart hammered as she heard voices calling her name, growing closer with each echo off the canyon walls. "She's got to be around here somewhere." That was Morrison's voice, angry and frustrated. 3 days in this heat, she can't have gotten far on foot. Maybe she's dead already, another voice suggested. Tommy, Elizabeth thought, could be buzzard bait by now. She better not be, Morrison snarled. The colonel wants her alive and undamaged, and he don't accept failure kindly, if you know what I mean. Marcus returned to Elizabeth's side, his expression tense in the darkness. 5 men, well armed. They're making camp about half a mile down the canyon, probably planning to search the area systematically come morning. He looked at her seriously. I can get you out of here, but it means traveling at night. Across country I know, but they don't. Where would we go? There's a place, a hidden valley where some of Golden Eagle's people still live. You'd be safe there while we figure out what to do about Bradley. Marcus paused, studying her face in the dim starlight filtering through the cave entrance. But it's a hard journey, and dangerous. These aren't city trails we'd be following. Elizabeth thought about her comfortable life in San Francisco, the servants and carriages and social obligations that had defined her existence for so long. Then she thought about Morrison's hands on her, about Colonel Bradley's obsession, about the people who had died to protect her when she was too young to understand. I'm tired of running, she said quietly, and I'm tired of being protected while others suffer because of who I am. If there are survivors of my father's people still alive, I want to meet them. I want to learn what it means to be the Moon Daughter. Marcus studied her face for a long moment, and she had the feeling he was seeing her clearly for the first time. It won't be easy. You'll have to leave everything you've known behind. Everything I've known was built on a lie. Maybe it's time I learned who I really am. Something shifted between them in that moment, a connection deeper than gratitude or simple attraction. Elizabeth reached out and touched his scarred hand, feeling the strength and gentleness there, the calluses that spoke of hard work and harder choices. Marcus, she began, but he pulled away gently. We should rest while we can. Tonight's going to be a long ride, and you're still recovering from your ordeal. But as Elizabeth settled back onto the furs, she caught Marcus watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. There was desire there, yes, but something deeper. A recognition, as if he was seeing not just the refined lady from San Francisco, but the Apache woman she was meant to be. The hours passed slowly as they waited for full darkness. Marcus used the time to prepare supplies and weapons, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to quick departures. He packed dried meat, hardtack, water, and buffalo hide containers, ammunition and medical supplies into saddlebags worn smooth by years of use. Tell me about the hidden valley, Elizabeth said as she watched him work. About the people there. Marcus paused in his preparations, his hands still on the leather straps he was adjusting. They're survivors, like you. Apache mostly, but some Navajo and even a few Mexican families who've chosen to live free, rather than submit to government authority. His voice grew warm with affection. They've built something beautiful there, Elizabeth. A community based on the old ways but adapted to new realities. And they'll accept me, a woman who's lived as a white lady for 20 years. They'll see the mark on your shoulder and know you're Golden Eagle's daughter. That's all that will matter to them. Marcus met her eyes in the flickering candlelight. But they'll also see how you've lived, how you've been shaped by the white world. It will be complicated. Elizabeth nodded, understanding more than she'd initially realized. She would be caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. But perhaps that was exactly where she needed to be. The stars were brilliant overhead when Marcus finally judged it safe to move. He'd saddled 2 horses. His own, a sturdy bay gelding that moved like silk despite its obvious strength, and a smaller mare with intelligent eyes and the deep chest that spoke of endurance. Stay close and trust the horse, he whispered as he helped her mount. His hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary, and Elizabeth felt heat rise in her cheeks. These trails are treacherous in the dark, but your mare knows them well. Her name is Luna. Seemed appropriate. They rode in single file through narrow canyons and over rocky mesas, Marcus leading with sure instincts despite the darkness. Elizabeth found herself admiring his skill, the way he moved in perfect harmony with his mount, reading the landscape like a map written in shadows and starlight. Several hours into their journey, Marcus called a halt near a natural waterhole surrounded by cottonwood trees. The horses drank gratefully while their riders rested, sharing dried meat and water in comfortable silence. You could have turned me over to them, Elizabeth said quietly, as they prepared to resume their journey. It would have been safer for you. Marcus looked at her, his pale eyes almost silver in the moonlight. Is that what you think of me? No, Elizabeth said quickly, but I don't understand why you'd risk so much for someone you barely know. Don't you? His voice was soft, but there was something underneath it that made her pulse quicken. They were standing close now, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, smell the clean scent of sage and leather that clung to his clothes. When he reached out to touch her face, his fingers gentle on her cheek, Elizabeth didn't pull away. "You're beautiful," he said, his voice rough with surprise, as if the words had escaped without his permission. "Not just your face, though, that's lovely enough, but the strength in you, the courage. You remind me why I stopped believing the world was entirely evil." "Marcus." Elizabeth felt herself leaning toward him, drawn by something she couldn't name. It had been years since Charles died, years since any man had looked at her with such naked want and tenderness combined. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, but when Elizabeth responded, her arms winding around his neck, it deepened into something desperate and wild. 20 years of loneliness and grief and searching seemed to pour out of both of them. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Marcus rested his forehead against hers, his hands still cradling her face as if she were something precious that might disappear. "This is madness," he whispered. "You're a lady from San Francisco, accustomed to comfort and civilization. I'm a deserter living in a cave, with nothing to offer but danger and hardship. Right now, I'm just Elizabeth," she said, her voice steady despite the way her heart was racing. "And you're the man who saved my life, who's showing me who I really am." Before Marcus could respond, the sound of gunfire echoed across the desert, distant but unmistakable. They both froze, listening intently as the shots continued in a pattern that suggested organized pursuit rather than random violence. "That came from the direction of your cave," Elizabeth said. Marcus swore softly, his expression grim as he helped her back onto her horse. "They found it. Won't take them long to pick up our trail from there." He swung into his own saddle with fluid grace. "We need to reach the hidden valley by dawn, or we'll be trapped in the open." They rode hard for the rest of the night, the horses laboring up steep trails and across loose scree that threatened to send them tumbling into the valleys below. Elizabeth's body ached from the unaccustomed riding. It had been years since she'd spent so long in the saddle, but she bit her tongue and held on, matching Marcus's punishing pace. The landscape grew increasingly wild and desolate as they climbed higher into the mountains. Towering rock formations loomed around them like ancient sentinels, carved by wind and water into fantastic shapes that seemed to watch their passage. In the distance, coyotes howled their eternal songs of hunger and loneliness. As the sky began to lighten in the east, painting the peaks with rose and gold, they crested a high ridge and Marcus pointed to a narrow cleft in the rock wall ahead. "There, that's the entrance to the valley." But even as he spoke, Elizabeth heard the sound she'd been dreading, the thunder of hoofbeats on stone getting closer by the minute. Morrison and his men had found their trail and were closing fast. "Go!" Marcus shouted, spurring his horse toward the cleft. "Don't look back." Elizabeth's mare lunged forward just as the first shot rang out behind them. The bullet sparked off rock inches from her head, sending chips of stone flying. She crouched low over the saddle, her horse's hooves finding miraculous purchase on stone worn smooth by countless years of wind and rain. The entrance to the valley was so narrow they had to ride single file, rock walls rising on either side like prison bars. Elizabeth could hear Morrison's voice shouting orders, the sound of his men's horses growing ever closer, their iron shoes ringing against stone. "There they are. Don't let them reach the canyon." More shots echoed off the narrow walls, bullets whining past Elizabeth's head as her mare galloped through the passage. The sound was deafening in the confined space, and she fought to control her mount as the animal shied from the noise. Then suddenly the walls opened up, and Elizabeth found herself in a hidden paradise that took her breath away. The valley was perhaps 2 miles long and half as wide, green with grass and trees fed by a crystal stream that wound through the center like a silver ribbon. Gardens and small dwellings were scattered throughout the valley, smoke rising from cooking fires as the inhabitants began their morning routines. But there was no time to admire the scenery. Marcus was already shouting to figures emerging from concealed shelters, his voice carrying clearly across the valley. "Riders coming through the pass, take defensive positions." Elizabeth's heart lurched as she realized what was about to happen. Morrison and his men were going to ride straight into an ambush, and there would be no way to avoid bloodshed. But as the first of the pursuers appeared in the narrow entrance, something went wrong. Instead of 5 men, at least a dozen riders poured into the valley. Morrison had found reinforcements during the night. "It's a trap," Marcus yelled, drawing his rifle with practiced speed. They knew about the valley. The peaceful morning erupted in gunfire as Morrison's men spread out, using the trees and rocks for cover. Elizabeth's horse reared in terror, and she fought to stay in the saddle as bullets whined overhead like angry hornets. Through the chaos, she saw Apache warriors taking positions on the valley's rim, their rifles and bows creating a deadly crossfire. But there were too many attackers, and the element of surprise was lost. That's when Elizabeth saw Morrison himself, recognizable even at a distance by his huge frame and distinctive black hat. He was working his way around the valley's edge, trying to flank the defenders. And he was heading straight for a group of women and children huddled behind a natural rock formation. Without thinking, Elizabeth spurred her horse toward the threatened civilians. She had no weapon, no plan, but she couldn't stand by and watch innocent people die because of her. "Elizabeth, no." Marcus's voice followed her, but she was already committed to her course. Morrison saw her coming and swung his rifle toward her, a triumphant grin splitting his ugly face. "There's our little princess. Boys, take her alive, but don't worry about being gentle." The shot that rang out wasn't Morrison's. It was Marcus's, firing from an impossible angle as he leaped from rock to rock with the agility of a mountain cat. Morrison's rifle flew from his hands as the bullet shattered his wrist, and he clutched the wound with a howl of pain and rage. But the distraction gave one of Morrison's men a clear shot at Marcus. Elizabeth watched in horror as the man's rifle swung toward the exposed position where Marcus was pinned down. "Marcus!" she screamed, but her warning came too late. The bullet took Marcus in the chest, spinning him around and sending him tumbling down the rocky slope. He landed hard and didn't move, blood spreading across his shirt like a crimson flower. "No!" Elizabeth abandoned any pretense of safety and ran toward where Marcus had fallen, heedless of the bullets flying around her. She found him conscious but bleeding heavily, his face pale with shock. "Elizabeth, get out of here!" he gasped. "They don't want me. Only you." "I'm not leaving you." Elizabeth pressed her hands against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding, but blood seeped between her fingers. The bullet had gone through his right lung, and she could hear the wet sound of his breathing that meant internal damage. Morrison's voice boomed across the valley as the gunfire gradually died down. "Enough! Cease fire!" The shooting stopped, leaving an eerie quiet broken only by the moans of the wounded and the nervous whinnying of horses. "Elizabeth Thornton, your boyfriend's dying, and my men have your Apache friends surrounded. Surrender now, and we'll let them live." Elizabeth looked around desperately. Morrison was right. His superior numbers and firepower had turned the tide of battle. The Apache defenders were trapped in defensive positions, outgunned and outnumbered. Several lay motionless in the grass, and others were clearly wounded. "Don't do it," Marcus whispered, his hand finding hers. Blood flecked his lips when he spoke. "Whatever Bradley wants, it's not worth your life, or theirs." But Elizabeth was already standing, her hands raised in surrender. "I surrender," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the valley. "Just let them tend to their wounded." Morrison's laughter echoed off the valley walls like the baying of a wolf. "Smart girl, you see, boys. Sometimes the Indians do know what's good for them." He gestured to his men. "Secure the prisoner, and try not to damage her. The colonel's particular about his merchandise staying in good condition." As Morrison's men closed in around her, Elizabeth bent down and kissed Marcus softly, tasting salt from her own tears and copper from the blood on his lips. "You showed me who I really am," she whispered against his mouth. "I'll never forget that." Then rough hands seized her arms, dragging her away as Marcus struggled weakly to sit up, calling her name. But the name he called wasn't Elizabeth. It was something else, something in Apache that sounded like music and heartbreak combined. Tuba-hina. And somehow, though she'd never heard the word before, Elizabeth knew exactly what it meant. Moon Daughter. The abandoned military fort squatted on the desert floor like a diseased animal, its adobe walls cracked by sun and neglect, wooden structures sagging under the weight of years and sand. Tumbleweeds had gathered in the corners of what had once been a parade ground. and the American flag that still flew from a bent pole was so faded and tattered, it was barely recognizable. Elizabeth had been imprisoned here for 3 days, locked in what had once been the commandant's quarters, now stripped bare except for a wooden chair and a straw mattress that smelled of mice and decay. The windows were barred, the door reinforced with iron straps, making escape impossible even if she'd had the strength to attempt it. Her captors had left her alone except for meals, hardtack and water delivered by a nervous young soldier who wouldn't meet her eyes. But she knew they were watching, waiting for something, or someone. During the long hours of solitude, Elizabeth had time to think about everything that had happened, everything she'd learned about herself and her heritage. The memories were coming back now in waves. Fragments of her childhood in Golden Eagle's village, her mother's voice singing lullabies in Apache, the feeling of safety and belonging she'd known before the massacre tore her world apart. She remembered riding behind her father on his war pony, learning to weave baskets from her grandmother, playing with other children in the crystal stream that ran through the village. She remembered the night terrors that had plagued her childhood in San Francisco, and now she understood they weren't nightmares but memories her mind had tried to suppress. The sound of approaching horses told her the waiting was over. Colonel Samuel Bradley was not what Elizabeth had expected. In her mind, she'd pictured another Morrison, brutal and crude, a man whose evil was written plainly on his face. Instead, the man who entered her prison was small and neat, with steel-gray hair, intelligent dark eyes, and the bearing of a career military officer who'd earned his rank through competence rather than brutality. His uniform was immaculate despite the desert heat, his boots polished to a mirror shine, his brass buttons gleaming. He carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to command, to having his orders obeyed without question. When he removed his hat, she could see he was completely bald beneath his carefully combed hair. "Miss Thornton," he said pleasantly, his voice cultured and precise. "Or should I say, Tubahina, moon daughter of the Apache." Elizabeth remained seated on the wooden chair, her hands folded in her lap, projecting a calm she didn't feel. 3 days of captivity had taught her that showing fear only encouraged her captors. "I prefer Elizabeth, thank you." Bradley smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. "Of course, 20 years of civilization must have buried your savage heritage quite deeply." He pulled out a camp stool and sat across from her, like a visitor making a social call. "Though I must say, the resemblance to your father is remarkable. Same proud bearing, same defiant eyes. Even the way you hold your head, pure Golden Eagle. You knew my father well. Golden Eagle. Oh yes, we were well acquainted. I spent the better part of 3 years hunting him, studying his tactics, learning to think like him." Bradley's tone was almost admiring. "A worthy adversary. Intelligent, resourceful, utterly devoted to his people. Much like his daughter, I suspect." Elizabeth felt her composure crack slightly at the casual way he spoke of hunting her father like an animal. "You murdered him." "I did my duty as a soldier of the United States Army," Bradley corrected mildly, his tone suggesting he was discussing the weather rather than genocide. "Your father was an enemy combatant who refused to submit to lawful authority. The raid was a military necessity to preserve order and protect American settlers. The raid was a massacre. Women and children." "War is regrettable," Bradley interrupted, his voice taking on the patient tone of a teacher correcting a slow student, "but necessary to secure America's manifest destiny. Your father understood that, even if he chose the wrong side." His tone became almost conversational. "Tell me, Miss Thornton, what do you remember of your childhood before the Thorntons took you in?" Elizabeth met his gaze steadily, though her heart was racing. "Nothing of importance." "I think you're lying." Bradley's voice remained pleasant, but there was steel underneath now, the iron will that had made him a successful military commander. "I think you remember more than you're admitting. Dreams, perhaps? Fragments of songs in a language you shouldn't know? The sound of your mother's voice speaking words you can't quite recall but that make your heart ache?" Despite herself, Elizabeth felt a chill. He was describing her nightmares with uncanny accuracy, as if he'd been inside her head during those long, tormented nights of her childhood. Bradley saw her reaction and smiled with genuine satisfaction. "Blood memory is a powerful thing among the Apache, Miss Thornton. They believe the spirits of ancestors speak through their children, that sacred knowledge passes from generation to generation through dreams and visions. He stood and began pacing the small room, his movements precise and controlled. Your father hid something before he died, something so valuable he was willing to sacrifice his entire people to protect it. I don't know anything about any treasure. Not treasure in the way most men think of it, Bradley agreed, his eyes gleaming with the fervor of a true believer. Gold and silver are valuable, certainly, but in this country, there's something worth infinitely more. He stopped pacing and looked directly at her. Water, Miss Thornton. Pure, sweet water in quantities sufficient to support a city. Elizabeth kept her expression neutral, but inwardly she reeled. Marcus had been right about Bradley's obsession. The Apache call it the gift of the moon goddess, a network of underground springs and rivers that could irrigate millions of acres of desert, support hundreds of thousands of settlers, make this wasteland bloom like the Garden of Eden. Bradley's eyes gleamed with fanatic fervor. Your father created a map of these water sources, hid it somewhere only his bloodline could find it. And you, dear child, are the key to unlocking that map. Even if such a thing existed, I wouldn't know where to find it. Ah, but you would, given the proper encouragement. Bradley walked to the door and spoke to someone outside. Bring him in. Elizabeth's heart sank as Morrison entered, his arm in a sling from Marcus's bullet but his cruel grin intact. Behind him came two other men carrying a struggling figure between them. An elderly Apache man, thin and weathered as old leather, but his black eyes burned with unquenchable dignity. They threw him to the floor at Bradley's feet, but the old man immediately straightened to a sitting position, his gaze never leaving Elizabeth's face. Despite his obvious mistreatment, he radiated a quiet strength that reminded her powerfully of her fragmentary memories of her father. Miss Thornton, may I present Joseph Standing Bear, last of your father's war chiefs, Bradley said conversationally. He's been most uncooperative regarding the location of Golden Eagle's hidden stronghold, but perhaps seeing you will loosen his tongue. The old man spoke, his voice cracked with age but still strong. The words were in Apache, but somehow Elizabeth understood their meaning with perfect clarity. You have grown beautiful, Moon Daughter. Your father would be proud to see the woman you have become. Elizabeth gasped, her hand flying to her throat. She shouldn't understand Apache. She'd never studied it, never heard it spoken except in the fragments of memory that haunted her dreams. Yet the words were as clear as English in her mind. Bradley noticed her reaction immediately, his eyes sharpening with predatory interest. Fascinating. The blood memory stirs, doesn't it? Soon you'll understand much more than simple words. He nodded to Morrison. Begin the demonstration. Morrison pulled out a long-bladed knife, its steel gleaming wickedly in the afternoon light filtering through the barred window. This is gonna be fun, he said, advancing on Standing Bear with obvious relish. No! Elizabeth lurched to her feet. Leave him alone. Then tell me where your father hid the map, Bradley said reasonably, as if discussing the price of grain rather than torture. I don't know. I was 5 years old when he died. But your blood knows. Your spirit knows. Bradley watched with clinical interest as Morrison grabbed Standing Bear's left hand, stretching it flat against the floor. The Apache believe great pain can unlock ancestral memories, that suffering opens doorways in the mind that are usually closed. Shall we test that theory? The knife descended, and Standing Bear's scream echoed off the adobe walls. But even through his agony, the old man's eyes remained fixed on Elizabeth's face, and she could see the message there. Be strong. Remember who you are. This is just the beginning, Miss Thornton, Bradley said calmly as Morrison repositioned his blade for another cut. I have all the time in the world, and Mr. Morrison has a great deal of creativity when it comes to causing pain. Morrison was already selecting his next target, the knife hovering over Standing Bear's other hand. One word from you ends this suffering. Elizabeth's mind raced desperately. She had to get them out of here somehow. Had to save Standing Bear and find a way to warn the survivors about Bradley's plans. Then she remembered Marcus's words about the Apache hidden in the mountains, survivors who might be watching even now. Stop, she said quietly. Bradley raised his hand, and Morrison paused with obvious reluctance. You have something to tell me? "The map isn't hidden in a place," Elizabeth said, her voice growing stronger as the lie took shape in her mind. "It's hidden in a person. In me." Standing Bear's eyes met hers, and she saw understanding there, and approval. Whatever she was planning, he would play along and help however he could. Bradley leaned forward intently, like a hawk focusing on prey. "Explain." "My father knew the army would hunt for any physical map, any written record. So he used the oldest Apache method. He encoded the locations in a song, a ceremonial chant that only the Moon Daughter could remember." Elizabeth met Standing Bear's eyes again, hoping he would understand her deception and support it. But the memory was buried by trauma, locked away where even I couldn't reach it. It would take a specific ritual to bring it back. Standing Bear nodded slowly, speaking in Apache with the authority of a war chief. "The ceremony of Moon Awakening. It must be performed at the place where Golden Eagle fell, where his spirit still walks among the stones." Elizabeth somehow understood every word, and she saw Bradley's eyes light up with triumph and greed. "And where did your father fall?" Bradley asked. I don't remember exactly," Elizabeth said, letting uncertainty and confusion creep into her voice. "The trauma blocks so much. The old man would have to guide us there. He was with my father at the end." She paused as if struggling with painful memories. "And the ritual requires specific conditions. The full moon, certain herbs that only grow in that area, complete freedom from restraint. The spirits won't speak if I'm bound or threatened." Bradley studied her face intently, looking for any sign of deception. Elizabeth forced herself to meet his gaze steadily, projecting the helpless honesty of a woman broken by circumstances beyond her control. After a long moment, he nodded with satisfaction. "Very well. The moon will be full in 3 days. We'll make the journey then." He turned to Morrison, his voice sharp with command. "Increase security around both prisoners, and send word to Lieutenant Hayes. I want 2 full squads for this expedition. If there are other Apache in those mountains, I intend to be prepared for them." As the soldiers filed out, leaving Elizabeth alone with her racing thoughts, she prayed desperately that Marcus was still alive, that the Apache survivors would see them coming, and that 3 days would be enough time for a miracle. The journey to Golden Eagle's last battleground took 2 days of hard riding through increasingly treacherous terrain. Elizabeth rode with her hands bound but otherwise unmolested. Bradley was taking no chances with his precious key to the water sources. Standing Bear, despite his wounded hand and obvious pain, sat his horse with the dignity of a war chief, his eyes constantly scanning the mountains around them for signs that might be invisible to his captors. Bradley had brought nearly 30 men, a full cavalry patrol equipped for extended operations in hostile territory. They moved in military formation, scouts ranging ahead, flankers protecting the column's sides. It was overkill for escorting 2 prisoners, but Elizabeth understood Bradley's thinking. He expected trouble and intended to be ready for it. On the evening of the 2nd day, they made camp in a sheltered canyon that provided water and defensible positions. As Elizabeth sat by the fire under heavy guard, Standing Bear was brought over to share the evening meal. The old man moved stiffly, favoring his injured hand, but his spirit remained unbroken. "Tomorrow, we reach the sacred place," he said quietly in Apache, his words hidden from their guards by the crackling of the fire and the casual conversation of the soldiers. "Will there be others there?" Elizabeth asked in the same language, surprised by how naturally the words came to her. "Perhaps. The spirits sometimes call the living to witness important events." Standing Bear's eyes twinkled with what might have been humor. "Your young warrior, if he lives, has a way of appearing when least expected." Elizabeth's heart leapt at the possibility that Marcus might have survived his wounds, might even now be following their trail. But she forced herself to remain realistic. Even if he was alive, what could one man do against 30 soldiers? On the morning of the 3rd day, they reached a high valley that Elizabeth recognized from her dreams, a place where wildflowers grew among weathered stones, and a small stream ran clear and cold from hidden springs. This was where her father had made his last stand, where her mother had died protecting her, where her old life had ended, and her new one begun. "Here," Standing Bear said in English, his first word in that language since his capture. Golden Eagle fell here, defending the sacred spring that gives life to this valley. Bradley dismounted and surveyed the valley with obvious satisfaction. Perfect. Natural cover, multiple escape routes, and far enough from any settlements that we won't be disturbed. He turned to Elizabeth, his eyes bright with anticipation. The ritual begins at moonrise? Elizabeth nodded, though her heart was hammering with anxiety. She had no idea what she was going to do when the moon rose, and Bradley expected her to magically remember locations that might not even exist. All she knew was that she had to buy time, had to hope that somehow help would come. "Sir," one of the soldiers posted as Lookout came running down from the ridge, his face flushed with excitement. "Riders approaching from the north. Maybe half a dozen, moving careful-like." Bradley swore softly, his hand moving instinctively to his sidearm. "Comancheros? Don't think so, sir. They're moving too careful, like they're scouting rather than raiding." Elizabeth's pulse quickened. Could it be Marcus? She'd seen no sign of pursuit during their journey, but if he'd survived his wound and managed to gather help— "Take defensive positions," Bradley ordered, his voice crisp with military authority. "Morrison, keep the prisoners secure but out of sight. If this is just travelers passing through, we'll let them go on their way. If it's trouble—" He left the sentence hanging, but his meaning was clear. The soldiers melted into the rocks and scrub brush with practiced efficiency, their blue uniforms blending with the shadows. Elizabeth found herself pressed against a boulder with Morrison's knife at her throat, standing bare beside her with similar restraint. "One sound and you're both dead," Morrison whispered, his breath hot and foul against her ear. But Elizabeth's attention was focused on the approaching riders, now visible on the valley's rim. Her heart soared as she recognized the tall figure in the lead, Marcus, alive and moving with only a slight stiffness to suggest his recent wound. Behind him rode 5 Apache warriors, their faces painted for war, their weapons ready. Marcus called out in Apache, his voice carrying clearly across the valley. "Samuel Bradley, I know you're down there. Come out and face what you've done like the soldier you claim to be." Bradley stepped into view, his rifle trained on Marcus with rock-steady hands. "Marcus Stone, I thought you were dead. Hard to kill a bad conscience, Colonel." Marcus urged his horse down the slope, his companions spreading out to cover him. "Let the woman and the old man go. This is between you and me." "I'm afraid it's much more complicated than that," Bradley replied, his voice carrying the reasonable tone of a man discussing a business transaction. "Miss Thornton has information vital to national security, information that could open up this territory to proper development and bring prosperity to thousands of American settlers. I can't simply release her because an Apache-loving deserter asks nicely. Then let's discuss terms." Marcus dismounted about 50 yards away, well within rifle range but projecting casual confidence that Elizabeth found both admirable and terrifying. "You want the location of Golden Eagle's water sources? I'll make you a deal." Elizabeth felt Morrison tense beside her. This wasn't part of any plan she knew about, and she feared Marcus was about to sacrifice himself for nothing. "I'm listening," Bradley said, though his rifle never wavered from its target. "Single combat. You and me, Bradley. Winner takes all. The woman, the old man, and whatever secrets they might have." Marcus's voice carried across the valley with deadly calm. "Unless you're afraid to face me without a squad of soldiers backing you up." Bradley's face flushed with anger at the implied cowardice. "You forget yourself, deserter. I'm a colonel in the United States Army, and you're a traitor who abandoned his post in the face of the enemy." "I'm a man who couldn't live with murdering innocent people," Marcus shot back. "But I'm willing to bet you're still the same coward who ordered the massacre of women and children, rather than face Golden Eagle in honest battle." The insult hung in the air like a challenge that couldn't be ignored. Elizabeth could see Bradley struggling between caution and wounded pride, his military training warring with his personal honor. "Sir," Morrison whispered urgently, "it's obviously a trap. Let me just shoot him and be done with it." But Bradley was already unbuckling his gun belt, his decision made. "No. He wants to die like a man. I'll accommodate him." He stepped into the clearing, his service revolver gleaming in the afternoon sun. "What are your terms, Stone?" "Traditional duel. 20 paces, turn and fire on count of 3. Marcus was already walking to the center of the valley, his movements fluid despite his recent injury. No interference from either side, regardless of outcome. Bradley followed, his face set with grim determination. And when I kill you, your Apache friends retreat and leave us in peace. When you kill me, they'll honor the agreement, Marcus said. But Elizabeth caught something in his tone, a confidence that didn't match his words. He had a plan, she realized. Whether it would work was another question entirely. The two men stood back to back in the center of the valley, their weapons ready. One of the Apache warriors began counting in English, his voice steady and ceremonial. 1, 2, 3, 4. Elizabeth watched in agonized suspense as the two men paced away from each other, their boots crunching on the rocky ground. This was madness. Even if Marcus won, Bradley's soldiers would never honor the agreement. 15, 16, 17. At 18 paces, Marcus suddenly stumbled, as if his wound had affected his balance. Bradley glanced back with contempt, a slight smile playing at his lips as he continued his measured steps. 20! Both men turned, their guns rising with practiced speed. Bradley fired first, his shot echoing off the valley walls like thunder. But Marcus was no longer where Bradley expected him to be. The stumble had been a feint, dropping him into a shooting crouch that spoiled Bradley's aim. Marcus's return shot took Bradley in the chest, the heavy revolver bullet spinning him around and dropping him to the rocky ground. The colonel tried to raise his gun for a second shot, but his strength was fading fast, blood spreading across his uniform. You cheated, Bradley gasped, his eyes already glazing with approaching death. I adapted, Marcus replied, walking over to stand above his former commander. Something you never learned to do. Bradley's gun fell from nerveless fingers as he died, his obsession with Apache gold dying with him. For a moment, the valley was silent except for the whisper of wind through the rocks. Then all hell broke loose. Morrison roared with rage and lunged toward Elizabeth with his knife. But Standing Bear, despite his wounded hand and advanced age, caught the big man's wrist. The two struggled briefly, Morrison's superior strength gradually overcoming the old man's resistance. The Apache warriors opened fire on the hidden soldiers, their shots precise and deadly. But Bradley's men were well-trained professionals who quickly recovered from the shock of their commander's death and began returning fire with disciplined volleys. Elizabeth saw Morrison's knife rising toward Standing Bear's throat and acted without thinking. She grabbed a fist-sized rock and brought it down on Morrison's wounded arm with all her strength. The big man screamed and dropped the knife, giving Standing Bear the opening he needed to break free. Within minutes, the valley was secure. The remaining soldiers, demoralized by their leader's death and outnumbered by the Apache reinforcements who emerged from concealment, surrendered without further resistance. Elizabeth ran to Marcus, her hands shaking as she examined the blood seeping through his shirt. You're hurt worse than you let on. I've been better, Marcus admitted, leaning heavily against her. The duel had reopened his chest wound and she could see the effort it had cost him. But I couldn't let them take you without a fight. How did you find us? Standing Bear's grandson was watching from the rocks when they took you, one of the Apache warriors explained in accented English. He followed at a distance, then came to get us when he knew where Bradley was headed. Standing Bear approached them, his dignity intact despite his ordeal. He spoke to Elizabeth in Apache, and again she understood perfectly. Your father would be proud, Moon Daughter. You have found your true strength and courage. I understand what he's saying, Elizabeth said wonderingly. How is that possible? Marcus smiled weakly, his arm around her waist for support. Apache believe blood calls to blood. Maybe being back where your father died, where your people made their stand, awakened something that was always there. Standing Bear nodded gravely and continued speaking. The ceremony you spoke of to fool the white colonel. It is real. There is indeed a song that holds the secret of the water places, but it is not what the white man thought. It speaks not of treasure for taking, but of sacred places for protecting. Elizabeth felt a stirring in her memory, fragments of melody beginning to surface. I think I'm starting to remember. Remember what? Marcus asked. A song my mother used to sing, about hidden places where the earth gives forth its gifts freely, where the spirits dwell in peace. Elizabeth's eyes widened as more of the melody came back to her. It wasn't about treasure at all. It was about responsibility. the Moon Daughter's sacred duty to protect the water sources from those who would abuse them. Standing Bear smiled for the first time since his capture, his weathered face transformed by joy. She remembers. The blood awakens. As they prepared to leave the valley, Elizabeth took one last look around the place where her father had made his final stand. She could almost see him, tall and proud, fighting to protect his people and his daughter's future. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it was tempered now by something else, a sense of connection to the man she'd never really known, but whose courage flowed in her veins. The captured soldiers were disarmed and given horses, then sent back toward the nearest military post with a message. The Apache were not defeated, would never be defeated as long as there were mountains to hide in and people willing to fight for their freedom. Some of Bradley's men looked relieved to be going home. Others seemed thoughtful, perhaps reconsidering what they'd been told about savage Indians. Morrison, however, would not be going anywhere. He died during the brief battle, cut down by an Apache arrow when he tried to use Elizabeth as a human shield. She felt no grief for his passing. The world was a better place without men like him. "What happens now?" Elizabeth asked Marcus as they rode away from the battlefield, heading toward the hidden valley where she'd first tasted freedom. "That's up to you," he said, though she could hear the hope underlying his careful neutrality. "You could go back to San Francisco, resume your old life. Bradley's dead, and his obsession died with him. No one there needs to know what happened here." Elizabeth considered this for a moment, thinking of her comfortable house on Nob Hill, her social obligations, the predictable rhythm of a life that had once seemed so important. Then she shook her head firmly. "I can't go back to being someone I never really was. But I don't know who I'm supposed to be now either." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his horse picking its way carefully down a rocky trail. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but certain. "Maybe you don't have to choose between Elizabeth Thornton and the Moon Daughter. Maybe you can be both." "What do you mean?" "You've lived in both worlds, learned from both cultures. Maybe that's exactly what your people need. Someone who can bridge the gap between white and Apache. Someone who understands both sides well enough to help them understand each other." Elizabeth felt something settle into place in her heart, a sense of rightness she'd never experienced before. "You think I could make a difference?" "I think you already have. Look around you." Elizabeth did and saw something remarkable. The Apache warriors who rode with them weren't the broken, defeated people she'd expected to find. They were proud, strong, united in their determination to survive and protect what remained of their culture. And they looked at her not with suspicion or resentment, but with hope. Moon Daughter, Standing Bear had called her. Not just a title, but a responsibility. A calling. 3 weeks later, Elizabeth stood outside a simple adobe house in the hidden valley where Marcus had first brought her. But this wasn't the same valley. This one was larger, more prosperous, home to nearly 200 people from a dozen different tribes who'd chosen freedom over the reservation system. The house was small, but well built, with a deep porch that caught the morning sun and a view of the mountains beyond. Marcus had built it himself, with help from the Apache survivors who'd become his extended family over the years. "It's not what you're used to," Marcus said, standing beside her with obvious nervousness. His wounds had healed well, leaving only thin scars to mark Bradley's bullets. "No servants, no fancy furniture, no society parties?" "It's perfect," Elizabeth said, and meant it with all her heart. The simple beauty of the place spoke to something deep in her soul, a hunger she hadn't even known she possessed. Over the past weeks, she'd learned much about her heritage from Standing Bear and the other elders. The water sources Bradley had been so desperate to find were real, scattered throughout the mountains in a network of springs and underground rivers that the Apache had protected for generations. But they weren't treasure to be exploited. They were sacred sites carefully tended and shared according to ancient laws that ensured their preservation. Elizabeth had also discovered her role as the Moon Daughter. It wasn't just a title or a mark of royal blood. It was a sacred trust, a responsibility to protect the water sources and use her unique position to help her people survive in a changing world. "The offer still stands," Marcus said quietly, his hands clasped behind his back like a nervous schoolboy. "You don't have to stay here just because you feel obligated. I'll understand if you decide this life isn't for you." Elizabeth turned to face him, seeing the uncertainty in his pale eyes. This strong, brave man who'd risked everything to save her was afraid she'd leave him. "Marcus Stone," she said, reaching up to touch his bearded cheek with gentle fingers. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking you to build a life with me," he said, catching her hand and pressing it against his face. "Whatever that looks like, wherever it leads us. I love you, Elizabeth. Both of you, the lady from San Francisco and the moon daughter of the Apache." "Then yes," she said, standing on her toes to kiss him softly. "Yes to all of it." The wedding took place a month later, conducted according to both Apache tradition and Christian ceremony. Elizabeth wore a dress of white deerskin decorated with beadwork that told the story of the moon's journey across the sky, while Marcus stood proud in a mixture of his old cavalry uniform and Apache ceremonial clothing. Standing Bear performed the Apache ceremony, speaking words that bound them not just to each other, but to the land and the people they would serve together. A visiting missionary, one of the few white men trusted by the Apache, added Christian vows that satisfied Elizabeth's upbringing. As the sun set over the hidden valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Elizabeth thought about the strange journey that had brought her here. She'd lost one family to violence and greed, but she'd found another in the most unexpected place. The Apache had a saying that Standing Bear had taught her: every person had a path written in the stars, a destiny that would unfold when the time was right. Elizabeth had spent 52 years thinking she knew what her path was, only to discover she'd been walking in circles, lost in a life that was never truly hers. Now, with Marcus's arms around her and the sound of Apache children laughing in the distance, she finally felt like she was home. The crescent moon birthmark on her shoulder seemed to pulse with warmth, as if her father's spirit was blessing this new beginning. "What are you thinking about?" Marcus asked, his voice soft in her ear. "The future," Elizabeth said, leaning back against his solid warmth. "For the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of what comes next." In the distance, Standing Bear began singing an ancient song of gratitude, his voice carrying across the valley like a prayer. Elizabeth found herself humming along, the melody as familiar as her own heartbeat, the words rising from some deep place in her memory where they'd been waiting all these years. But this wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. Over the months and years that followed, Elizabeth would use her unique position to help her people in ways her father could never have imagined. She would negotiate with government officials, using her education and social connections to secure better treatment for reservation Apache. She would establish schools that taught both Apache traditions and white skills, preparing young people to survive in a changing world without losing their cultural identity. She would help establish trade relationships that brought prosperity to the hidden valleys, teaching Apache artisans to market their work to collectors in San Francisco and beyond. She would write letters to Eastern newspapers, telling the true story of her people's struggle and gradually changing public opinion about the Indian problem. Most importantly, she would work with Marcus to create a network of safe havens throughout the Southwest, places where Apache and other tribes could live, according to their own laws, while still maintaining peaceful relations with their white neighbors. The water sources that Bradley had died trying to find remained secret, protected by the Moon Daughter and her people. But their true treasure, the knowledge of how to live in harmony with the land, gradually spread beyond the hidden valleys, taught to anyone willing to learn respect for the desert's harsh gifts. Elizabeth never returned to San Francisco as a resident, though she occasionally visited on business. The grand house on Nob Hill was sold, the proceeds used to fund schools and medical clinics in Apache territory. Her former friends were scandalized by her choices, but Elizabeth found she didn't care. She'd discovered something more valuable than social approval, a sense of purpose that filled every day with meaning. She was Elizabeth Thornton, refined lady of San Francisco society. She was also Tubahi Na, the Moon Daughter, child of Golden Eagle and inheritor of Apache wisdom. And most importantly, she was Marcus Stone's woman, ready to build a new life in this harsh, beautiful country that had somehow become home. Years later, when gray streaked her auburn hair and lines mapped the years of laughter and hard work on her face, Elizabeth would sit on her porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of fire. Children and grandchildren, some Apache, some white, some beautifully mixed, would gather around her feet as she told stories of the old days, when the world seemed simpler, but was actually far more complex. And sometimes, when the moon was full and the desert wind carried the scent of sage and promise, she would sing the ancient songs her mother had taught her, the melodies that spoke of water and life and the eternal responsibility to protect what was sacred. The stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, and Elizabeth made a silent promise to her father's spirit. She would honor both sides of her heritage, bridging two worlds with love instead of letting them be torn apart by hatred and greed. It was, she thought, a worthy destiny for a woman who'd been lost for 50 years and was finally found. Standing Bear lived to see his 100th year, spending his final decade teaching young Apache the old stories and ceremonies that might otherwise have been lost. On the night he died, peaceful in his sleep, witnesses swore they saw a great golden eagle circling overhead, calling out in a voice that sounded remarkably like the war cry of a long-dead chief welcoming an old friend home. Marcus lived to be 73, his hair white as winter snow, but his love for Elizabeth as strong as ever. He died as he'd lived in his later years, protecting his people, leading a rescue mission to save Apache children from a corrupt Indian agent. His last words were Elizabeth's name, spoken in Apache, Tuba Hina. Elizabeth herself lived to see the new century dawn, to witness the end of the Indian Wars and the beginning of a new relationship between her people and the United States government. She lived to see Apache children graduate from universities, to see the hidden valleys become legal reservations with full government recognition, to see the water sources finally protected by federal law. But perhaps most importantly, she lived to see understanding gradually replace hatred, cooperation replace conquest. The bridge she'd built between two worlds grew stronger with each passing year, proof that love truly could triumph over fear. On her final night, surrounded by children and grandchildren whose very existence testified to the power of unity over division, Elizabeth looked up at the crescent moon shining through her bedroom window and smiled. She'd kept her promise to her father, had honored her mother's sacrifice, had fulfilled the destiny written in her blood and bones. The moon daughter's work was done. Sometimes life forces us to confront truths we never imagined about ourselves, and like Elizabeth, we discover that our greatest strength comes not from the identity we thought we had, but from embracing who we were always meant to be. Her journey from a sheltered San Francisco socialite to the fierce protector of her people reminds us that it's never too late to find our true purpose, to bridge the gaps that divide us, and to choose love over fear. What moments in your own life have revealed hidden strengths you never knew you possessed? Have you ever discovered that your greatest challenges led you to your most authentic self? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear how Elizabeth's transformation resonated with your own journey of self-discovery. If stories like this one, filled with romance, resilience, and the power of finding your true identity, speak to your heart, please subscribe to our channel and join our community of women who believe that the most beautiful chapters of our lives can begin at any age.